Okay, so now we're going to consider fiscal policy. Three aspects of fiscal policy. One, how the budget is formulated. Second, how the debt is related to the deficit. And third, how the deficit itself depends on the state of the economy. The third thing I want to discuss related to the deficit is the impact of the economy on the deficit. One thing that people forget is that when the economy goes into a recession, the deficit will automatically increase. And when it goes into a boom, the deficit declines and you get a surplus. This leads to a concept of so-called full employment surplus, which we'll show in a graph in a minute. But it also is important for political debates because sometimes people forget that the reason there's a deficit is because the economy is weak. Or the reason the deficit's going down is we see a surplus. Not a reason to be complacent, it just simply means the economy may be strong, maybe even temporarily strong. So let's look at this relationship. Here's a way to represent it graphically. The horizontal axis is real GDP. Vertical axis is budget surplus if it's positive or deficit if it's negative. The zero line is drawn in to represent budget balance. When the surplus is positive above zero, we call that the surplus, and as you go up on the line, it's a larger surplus. If you're below zero, that's a deficit, and you go down, that's a larger deficit. So the red line represents this tendency for the budget surplus or deficit to move depending on the state of the economy. If you're in a boom over on the right, the deficit tends to fall. In that case, revenues start to rise. In good economic times, people work more, unemployment goes down. And there's less spending, the unemployment compensation goes down, welfare payments go down, and things like that. In the reverse direction, in a recession, all those things reverse. Tax revenues go down over on the left of the curve, and so the deficit starts to increase, and spending starts to increase too, say for unemployment compensation. So this is a very robust relationship that occurs in the U.S. and in other economies, and it makes it really very important to try to think about how you interpret the deficit or surplus as the economy goes through its ups and downs. And that leads to this concept of a full employment surplus or full employment deficit, and that's illustrated in the next diagram. So we start with a measure of potential GDP in the same type of diagram we just had. The red line shows the relationship between the deficit and the surplus and the state of the economy. And then we've just marked in with the dashed line potential GDP. The concept now is with real GDP to the right of potential GDP, that's kind of a boom, and to the left, you're in a recession. The way this is drawn, potential GDP is the deficit at that point. This is an example where you may not be in a recession, you may be right on the potential GDP line, so imagine you are at potential GDP. Say the economy is full employment, is another word for GDP being at potential GDP. In this case, you have a deficit when GDP is equal to potential GDP. That's called a full employment deficit. If the economy improved from this position, went to a boom, you'd have budget balance or maybe even go into a surplus. This is a sign that we haven't really got the budget problems licked because even when the economy returns to full employment, there's a deficit. And that's illustrated here by this arrow called full employment surplus. In this case, the surplus is negative, so it's a deficit. So we would say we have a full employment deficit with this picture. It could go the other way. For example, if you had potential GDP over here, in this case, the economy was at its potential, there's a surplus. In this case, full employment surplus. It's a healthier situation to have a surplus at full employment than a deficit. But nonetheless, if you go in a recession from this point, you go to the left of the dashed line, the surplus will go down, and if you go far enough, you go into deficit. And that's not necessarily a concern because that's the automatic way in which revenues and spending adjust. Kind of an automatic process that's built into the law. Similarly, if you even went to the right of this line, you would get more of a surplus, and that might help to stabilize the economy with tax revenues rising to maybe slow down things as the economy went into a boom. Anyway, that's the relationship between the budget and the deficit surplus versus the real economy. In addition, defining this idea of a full employment surplus, that's what the surplus would be if the economy were at full employment, if the economy were at its potential GDP. Thank you very much.